Thanks for joining us for the first Tevora webinar in the new decade. DFARS and NIST 800-171, updates and how to stay compliant with imminent changes. I'm Kevin Cutter, a cybersecurity and compliance advisor for Tevora. Joining us today is Jeremiah Sahlberg, Managing Director of Tevora's federal and third-party risk practices. Before we dive in, a few details about us. Tevora is a pure-focus InfoSec management consultancy. We've specialized in the cybersecurity space, and only in this space since our inception, 2003. Tevora has 7 dedicated InfoSec practices: cloud security compliance, threat management, data privacy, cybersecurity framework compliance, incident response, enterprise risk management, and solutions implementations. These practices support several hundred services. Each one is overseen by a managing director, with directors, practice leads, consultants, and associates reporting up the chain of command, ensuring Tevora's 17-year methodology to information security is properly adhered to. Our project management team is tasked with meeting all of your deadlines and requests throughout any initiative. Tevora is ISO 27001 certified and has over 100 information security professionals with 0 contract employees. Our team service the entire US and trek all over the globe to support our international customers. We have offices in California, New York, and Virginia. We've grown our premier management consultancy organically at a pace that ensures we bring the quality and expertise our clients have come to expect. As we get started, please know you have the ability to ask questions throughout Jeremiah's presentation. Your questions will be answered as soon as he wraps up. Historically, we find the questions from your fellow information security professionals greatly benefit others that are listening in. As such, don't hesitate to ask anything. Over the weekend, the Department of Defense released the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, better known as CMMC program. We anticipate this to be an interesting topic for our audience and over the course of 2020. With that, Jeremiah, the floor is yours.
Kevin, thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's taking time out of their Tuesday to join us and listen in to this webinar. We will be talking today about DFARS and the newly dropped CMMC release that went out last Friday from the Department of Defense. So we'll go ahead and jump into things here. I like agendas, so we'll do a little bit of an agenda here. I'll just spend a very brief moment. I know Kevin gave us a little bit of an introduction about Tevora. I will jump in and do a few more details there. Then we'll get into the meat of things, talk a little bit about DFARS, kind of what are the requirements today, and what are the requirements that are coming tomorrow as part of CMMC. And then we'll reserve some time at the end for any questions that you may have. So as you come up with them, please put them into the chat box. Kevin will certainly relay those over towards the end of the presentation. So just to kind of recap, I know Kevin gave us an introduction about Tevora. We do have a couple different practice areas, certainly around the compliance. We do everything from PCI certifications. We have a number of QSAs, PA-DSS support, to SOC 2 assessments, HIPAA and high trust assessments. We are an accredited organization. I'll talk a little bit about this in more detail later on for doing DFARS and NIST 800-171 assessments. We do have an enterprise risk management team that will support everything from those smaller assessments that are required as part of PCI to large-blown enterprise risk assessments, rebuilding programs, to supporting the development of policies and procedures. We're well versed not only with GDPR, but also the CCPA requirements, as well as the newly released NIST privacy framework that just came out last week. Something that can certainly help as the different states are evolving their privacy requirements and giving proper guidance to get you through those, with everything from doing data privacy impact assessments to creating your own models and adhering to the various state and national laws. From the security solutions perspective, we partner with over 200 organizations to be able to deliver the best security tool sets that are needed to our customers' organizations. We do implement a number of those ourselves, others we partner with, but we do have the ability to bring all those security solutions to bear for an organization. Within our threat management team, we do our penetration testing, our web applications testing, mobile applications testing, IoT type testing, phishing exercises as well. So we've got a very robust team, everything from red teams to blue teams, purple teams. We can support a variety of situations there. And lastly, here we've got our incident response capabilities. One of the things that we're quite proud of is we are a PCI forensics investigator. We're one of, I believe it's 14 organizations that operate within North America. So if Visa, MasterCard declare a breach, an organization like ours has the ability, the knowledge, the experience to come in, do that incident response, as well as the forensics support that's needed to help get an organization to understand what happened and how to recover from that. As Kevin mentioned, we've been around for 17 years, and I'm very excited to be broadcasting today from our newest location in Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. So any of those that are in the D.C. area, you're more than welcome to come by. As mentioned, we've got a number of certifications. I won't rattle them off, but this is an area that we are certainly experts in. For those that haven't had a chance to meet me before, there's a not so great picture of me, but I'm Jeremiah Solberg, as Kevin mentioned, the Managing Director of Federal and Third-Party Risk. I have a number of certifications from CISM, CISP, QSA. I'm also a high trust assessor. It's interesting, I actually started my career back at the Department of Defense back in the first part of the 1990s as an intern working within the Defense Information Systems Agency. Did a little bit of time there and then moved my way into the commercial space, focusing on a number of different industries that are listed there, but I've always had a tie back to various state and local government agencies I've worked with. In the last number of years, I've been transitioning back into supporting the federal area, which is somewhere I began, so it's kind of interesting to see the full life cycle there. I've been a security engineer all the way down to those doing penetration testing activities, web application testing, but also made my way up as a CISO within an organization for a number of years. So I've worked both as an outside and someone on the inside who understands what those risks are that are faced day to day, as well as making sure that organizations are compliant with various different frameworks. Besides the day-to-day activities, I do like to get out and speak at various events. I have a couple of publications out there. I do sit on the board of advisors for a local university here in Virginia. Moving forward, what we're here to talk about today is DFARS, better known as the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. So I want to take a minute and kind of, before we jump into CMMC, is to focus in on what are the current requirements and ultimately to understand why the current model is evolving and why it needs to change, or it's being verified, if you would. So within DFARS, the idea here is whenever you have controlled unclassified information, also known as QE data, you've got to put the right kind of controls in place to make sure that it's properly protected. So within the defense industrial base, there are some reports, I think, 300,000 contractors and subcontractors. And not all information is classified, some of it is unclassified, but that unclassified information still needs to be properly protected. And so the intent here is that anytime that an organization uses, holds, process QE data, that it needs to be properly protected. Also included is federal contract information, FCI data. That's something that will certainly come into play and is called out more specifically within the CMMC framework that we'll talk a little bit more later on today. So let's dive into QE in a little bit more detail. So it's interesting, the organization that manages the different categories for QE is the National Archives. So they have some specific guidelines, categories that will talk about this type of data. And so if the organization has any sort of this controlled unclassified information in any of the contracts they're doing for the Department of Defense, then this information needs to be properly protected. And right now it's done under the NIST 800-171 as the specific requirements. And that's not changing. That's something you'll hear me say several times during today's presentation. The existing requirements for DFARS does not go away. It's not being replaced. CMMC is going to be a supplemental requirement for those pieces of CUI information. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about DFARS. So if you're currently a contractor or a subcontractor within the defense industry base, then you've got a couple core requirements. There's more, but these are the highlights, if you would. You certainly have to provide adequate security to protect that covered defense information. Second, if there are any cybersecurity incidents, that does need to be reported and reported right away. So they need to know about if there's a breach, and ultimately you have to maintain the environment so that that information can be investigated properly, and that we can obviously get the environment back up and running, but also to recover from any data loss and to put controls in place so it doesn't happen again. There is the DoD Cyber Crime Center, the DC3. It's required that any time that there's malicious software identified within the organization, that has to be submitted. They want to know these new indicators that they haven't seen before. Any APTs that you see something, you report it right away. As I mentioned, if there is an incident, that environment has to be preserved so that it can figure out what happened. And lastly, and probably the most important one here, is that all of these requirements not only apply, but must be flowed down to any subcontractors. It's very common within the contracting hierarchy that there could be 4, 5, 6, even 7, 8 layers of subcontracting down to some small businesses to provide services to the Department of Defense. And all of those contractors and subcontractors need to have the appropriate controls flowed down. So these are the existing requirements today as part of DFARS. That first one there, we talk about, what is adequate security? So within DFARS, they've called out adequate security is NIST 800-171. So when we're talking about these changes with CMMC, which is really a verification program that certain controls are actually are implemented and operating and in place. This isn't something new. There's already an existing requirement that organizations must meet NIST 800-171. So, which is interesting. We'll talk about in a little bit more detail here. But so adequate security currently, and the answer was NIST 800-171. What is NIST 800-171? What is NIST 800-171? It's really simple. If you're not familiar with it, then if you can go to the NIST website and pull it down, and it's the document for protecting controlled unclassified information in non-federal systems. It has a fixed set of baselines and requirements, and it's really focused around making sure that not only your policies are in place, that you've got the right kind of supporting processes and procedures within the organization, and ultimately that you've got the right type of IT and security configurations to support a more secure environment. Diving into NIST 800-171 in a little bit more detail, there are 14 different control families, and it covers 110 specific requirements, as you see up here on the board. So it's something that's out there. Organizations have been required to do this for quite some time. There's some beta documents coming out that have some control enhancements that you might be aware of. There's a couple other things that also have fold into this new CMMC. But so this is the current state of affairs. All the subcontractors and contractors and subcontractors are required to meet this. They put this in the DFARS, it's a supplement that gets attached as part of the requirements and saying, okay, you must adhere to this. So why do they have to come out with CMMC? Well, it turns out that this concept of just putting these requirements in contracts and saying organizations self-attest, yes, this is stuff that we do, it doesn't work. One of the reports from the Undersecretary of the DoD that came out on Friday, she was saying, globally, there has been over $600 billion of economic loss because of cybersecurity risk. I read another report that said that the U.S. alone has, in just 1 year, anywhere from $50 to $100 billion of loss from cybersecurity threats and risks that should have been fixed. So they're trying to move the needle. They're trying to do something that actually requires organizations to certify against a framework, and so they've created the CMMC, or the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And so let's jump into this a little bit. So it builds on the existing DFARS requirements. This isn't something new. This is something, the DFARS, it's not replacing DFARS, so that will still be in effect. But now it's a mechanism for them to measure how well an organization is meeting those requirements. And the degree that CMMC can measure an organization is going to vary. It's going to vary from if a level 1, which means all you require is a very basic cyber hygiene. Maybe you're just providing a small little part and it doesn't have a huge impact to the Department of Defense, to maybe you're a critical supplier, critical subcontractor that you need the most advanced level. So there's this concept of level 1 to level 5. And so what they're going to do is they're going to bring in, they're going to create a pool of certified independent third-party assessment organizations, much like we are for PCI or HITRUST or the current DFARS 800-171, an organization that come in here and can assess and say, yes, you do meet all those controls at that particular level. So it's really intended to be a verification mechanism, because the self-assessment practice just hasn't provided enough cybersecurity for those organizations to date. Who does this affect? So are there any exceptions to this? The Department of Defense is slowing this down to all contractors and all subcontractors. So it's going to be that there's no exemptions at all. Now, again, they're going to have certain levels that you're going to have to attest to, but you'll start to see more and more messaging come out about this over the coming year. But this concept of CMMC defining the levels, those levels will be defined in those contracts, and it is going to apply to everyone. So there's going to be no exceptions to this. So make sure if you're in that DoD supply chain, then this is certainly something that should be on your radar. Let's jump into the CMMC a little bit more detail here. So within CMMC, there are 17 different domain areas. Previously within the NIST 800-171, there were 14 domain areas. So there's a few more domain areas they've pulled into it. And what they've done is they've broken it down into two different areas. You've got this concept of processes and then practices. And so they've mapped these practices back to capabilities, but that sits a little bit different than the processes. So let's dive into processes for just a minute. So level 1, again, being the most basic, there's not really a requirement around the processes. It's a very basic cybersecurity footprint, with maybe a level 2 being that you've defined the policies for the environment, with level 3 being that you've created a resource plan to demonstrate that you've got the right kind of resources to execute against those processes that you put in place. A level 4 being that you've measured the effectiveness of those resources against those policies, and certainly 5 that will be that optimized. So very similar to the CMMI model, if anyone's worked against that. That's how they've indicated the different process levels. Whereas the practices, these are the things that must be done. And again, this spans the levels from level 1 to level 5. So there's this huge matrix they've put out there against all of these domains, against all of these capabilities, to map out all these different practices. And we'll dive into that a little bit more on the next slide here. But again, if you're just required, at a level 1, you may not be required to demonstrate you're doing so much, whereas you're a level 3, you're required to demonstrate that you're doing everything at least within NIST 800-171, whereas level 5, there are going to be additional requirements and practices that you're going to have to demonstrate that are in place for more advanced applications. Moving over here into the different practice areas for CMMC. Again, you have to meet all of the requirements at level 1 before you can become level 2. So level 3 requires all level 2 and so forth. So at level 1, it's very basic. It includes all of the basic FAR requirements from 48 CF 52204-21. And it is just 17 controls. When you move up to level 2, you do have a number of additional controls that are up to 72. Level 3, you're back into, you have to include all of the NIST 800-171 controls, which is 110 requirements, plus they've added in an additional 20 extra things they're going to look for verification around at the level 3 marker. And then level 4 and level 5, they've had even more controls they're going to be testing to test the maturity level of your cybersecurity operations. So one of the important takeaways here is to understand what's required by that contract from the DoD. What's being flowed down to you as a subcontractor, and where are you at within that particular maturity index? So I talked a little bit before about how it pulls information in from the FAR regulations. Again, it certainly pulls in everything that is in DFARS because that's still a requirement. Pulled in elements of NIST 800-171. At some of the more advanced levels, 4 and 5, they've pulled in some of the control enhancements that are documented in the NIST 800-171B. So if anyone here is familiar with NIST 853 and how those are bonus enhancements, those bonus enhancements, that same model is being applied to NIST 800-171 as well. They folded in some of the elements from the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Our good friends over at NIST 853 Rev 4. It'll be interesting to see when NIST 853 Rev 5 drops, if they're going to pull anything in from that, but we'll kind of see what time will tell what happens there. And interesting, they actually pulled in some additional requirements from our friends over in the UK and in Australia and from some of the frameworks they have. As I mentioned before, we're going from 14 domain areas to 17 domain areas with CMMC, and they've added the following 3 control families, if you would. Asset management, which is certainly an important one. And you've got recovery, so when you've got data that's been backed up, how do you verify you can recover from that? Certainly becomes important if you see any ransomware attacks that continue to hit a lot of the cities and state governments across the United States. And certainly understand your situational awareness. What kind of targets are coming after you as an organization, and to be prepared for that. All right, so now jumping forward, when? All right, we know that they dropped the regulations, and so when does this apply to you? Well, this has been they've been chatting about this for quite some time. Phase 1 of this, they started developing this framework late last year, or early last year, I should say. Back in July, they started putting out some of the draft requirements with version 0.1, up all the way through December when they put out version 0.7. And just as of last Friday, they finally released version 1.0, which is why we're here today. Everyone's getting excited about that. But what they haven't done is actually finalize the accreditation process for the assessors. So remember, part of this process is to get these independent assessors certified. That accreditation body, the CMMC accreditation body, or AB, has been developed. It was formed earlier last month in January, and they're right now developing that certification methodology for companies like Tevora to go out and conduct these assessments. So what we're really looking to see is that later this year, we will start actually being able to conduct these assessments once we've gone through the certification process, which they're still defining today. Similarly, what you'll see is RFIs coming out from the Department of Defense mid this year that will start declaring which levels contractors and subcontractors need to be, whether or not they're a level 1 requirement, 2, 3, and so forth. So we should start seeing a lot more discussion around that here in the coming months. So big excitement, they just dropped. As we were preparing for this webinar, the government's notorious for pushing things back. So we were hedging our bets whether or not this version 1.0 was actually going to be out by the time our webinar went live. As I mentioned before, in June this year, we should start to see those requirements as part of the RFIs that are coming out from the DoD. But again, it's important to know that any company, and all companies that are performing any sort of work for the DoD, will be required to meet these new CMMC requirements, even if it's just at a level 1, which is the most basic security requirements that are put out there. Let's see. And just to note one more time that CMMC does not replace the DFARS 800-171 requirements. This is just the verification process around it. So how do you prepare for this? I mean, you've heard about this, you know it's coming soon, it's something that you're going to have to address. What are some keys to start thinking about this as an organization that works within the defense industry? Certainly make sure that you've started evaluating your policies and standards and procedures against NIST 800-171. You should have already been doing this. If you haven't been doing this, then you're not living up to the expectations of the attestations that you've been already telling by signing up for government contracts. So certainly that's a good starting point. And that's really going to be mapped back to at a level 3 for the most part of CMMC. The next big thing I always recommend with our clients is to make sure that your SSP is up to date. That's, for those that don't know, your system security plan is your document on how you've defined your security controls to meet the security requirements within NIST 800-171 or whatever framework you're using. But in this case, we're talking NIST 800-171. So make sure you have that up to snuff. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you're on top of your POAMs. It'll be interesting as assessors come in to accredited organizations. If you're an organization that says, oh, well, I'm doing 80 of my 110 controls, I've got a POAM for 30 of them, it's going to be a very different story than assessing an organization that has all 110 controls in place and are consistently meeting them with a continuous monitoring. So that accreditation process will tease out those that aren't meeting all the controls that they should be meeting. So my guidance here is certainly evaluate what you got in place, get your SSP document up to par, and make sure that you're remediating any milestones that you've established for yourself against your POAMs. So how are you going to get certified? So once the C3PAOs have been established, you're going to reach out and coordinate with them directly. You're going to specify what the particular target level that you're looking to get. Do I want to be a level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4? And then what they'll do is they'll come in and actually perform that assessment against the organization. Once that assessment is done, and assuming that all of the criteria are met for the target level that you're looking at, there'll be an awarded certification that says that, yes, you are meeting the requirements as stated. So how can we help? We can help. Tevora can absolutely help. So something that we invested in heavily last year, we are en route to becoming a FedRAMP 3PAO. That's a very long process that we're past our 1-year anniversary on the first part of becoming a cybersecurity inspection body. So we are accredited as an ISO 17020 cybersecurity inspection organization. That's one of the primary steps in becoming a FedRAMP 3PAO. And that's something that we were awarded last year in October. We're quite proud of it. And when you're going through this process with the accrediting organization, in this case it was A2LA, they ask if there's any other process and procedures that we wanted to have included in our accreditation. And so since we were working so heavily with a number of the DoD contractors and already doing NIST 800-171 inspections, we asked them to include that as part of our accreditation process. So one of the things that came out last year, or one of the things that we achieved last year, is we are accredited by A2LA to be a cybersecurity inspection body against NIST 800-171 Rev 1. So those requirements that you must meet today are tied back to the level 3 requirements for CMMC. Is something we can certainly help with. We're accredited to do and have executed dozens for various clients in the defense industry. What's our approach? We've got a defined approach that certainly helps get our customers there, much like the assessment approach that a lot of organizations use, but it is first to do a gap assessment, understand what's in place within the organization. Second, there's a remediation phase. Sometimes they need some support within that remediation phase. And lastly, a full assessment that will demonstrate that they are meeting each of the control requirements. So we deliver reports to organizations. We go through a various data evidence collection, interviewing process, and seeing where the gaps are. It's a part of this overall assessment process, but we ultimately find where those gaps are. We map them back to the particular control requirements and give them recommendations on how to become compliant with that particular requirement, given their organization, the technologies that they've already invested in, and what's unique to them. Ultimately, that report then generates a work list. Hey, what needs to be remediated? So we tend to find that remediation efforts vary customer to customer. A lot of times, customers may be missing a proper incident response plan. They're missing some of the proper documentation around their policies and standards. In some cases, in all too many cases, we see that some of the solution requirements around multi-factor authentication aren't fully implemented for the areas that it's required, so they'll need something deployed. But ultimately, we're there to give them some support and to augment their team if it's needed. We certainly like customers to be vested in the remediation process, so things that they can handle themselves, they absolutely should. But if they need some expert to help give them some guidance direction on that, we certainly do that. Sometimes they need to reconfigure technology to meet the compliance, certainly around making sure logging systems, their SIM solutions are correlating and pulling the right kind of information together there. And then lastly, we'll come in and actually do the final assessment and attestation. We do have qualified staff. Again, we're an accredited organization, and ultimately we'll pull together a report that outlines the scope of the project, the methodology that we went through, full control of the control requirements, and how we've mapped the evidence back to it. So it becomes that really good seeding point to verify against your SSP. And in the cases where all the controls have been met, we will issue a letter of attestation. So we are certainly here to help organizations. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor up to any questions that may have come in. I know Kevin's been monitoring the inbox here. So at this time, Kevin, do we have any questions that have come up so far? Kevin, I don't know if you're on mute or.
Oh, hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now there.
Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, it's a great presentation, Jeremiah, and our audience appears to agree. We've actually had a few good questions come across. The first one on deck, will CMMC apply to cloud service providers? Does level 4, level 5, or FedRAMP moderate high satisfy the CMMC requirements?
So there's going to be an accreditation, it's my understanding. So they're still fleshing out a lot of the details, especially around the level 4 and level 5 areas, but that it's going to require accreditation at those level 4 and level 5 for all DoD contractors, whether or not you're a cloud service provider or not. If you're supplying services to the government, to the defense industry, then that is something that is going to be baked in there and formally defined. So the answer is yes, that's going to be something that is going to be required. Now, whether or not they're going to do some sort of reciprocity with FedRAMP, that hasn't been formalized yet. So more to come on that, but I'd be looking to make sure your environment meets all of the controls, because the FedRAMP controls are specifically to NIST 853, whereas the CMMC has all those other regulations built into it. So I don't know that they're going to give a carte blanche. I could be surprised and I could be wrong, but I would expect them to, because they've embedded additional control requirements, that those organizations are going to have to go through their own accreditation process.
Great. And then the next question is actually a two-parter, but how much will it cost for an organization to go through this process?
Great question. So that has not been finalized yet, but one of the key objectives the Undersecretary spoke about on Friday was that it needs to be an attainable cost, especially for the smaller businesses that support the defense industry. And so it's going to be reasonable, and it's going to be an allowable expense back into the Department of Defense under the contract. So people shouldn't have a financial fear for shying away from this. It's an allowable expense, which now I think they said it may be an allowable expense for certain levels. I don't know if that's across the board, but there may be an allowable expense for the certification process, not getting the controls in place, but for the attestation review process, that should be an allowable expense. That's at least the guidance that we've been told.
Great. And then the second part, and actually last question from what I'm seeing, how often do you need to get recertification?
That's a great question. We all want to know the answer to that one. I wish I knew the answer to that. They haven't actually formalized the guidance for the recertification. There's a number of FAQs that are out there on the DoD website that talk about, if weapons of a breach happens, do you lose your certification? Do you have to be recertified immediately? So that recertification question is something that is still being finalized and formalized. I can imagine there's some sort of annual, I wouldn't be surprised, this is pure speculation, so bear with me for a second, that there's going to be some sort of annual requirement coupled with maybe a surveillance every couple of years, probably akin to the FedRAMP process. But no, we don't have formal insight as to what that recertification timeline is going to be for the different levels. And it may vary, but from level 1 to level 5, we just don't know yet. A good question, really good question.
Yeah, and that actually is it from what I'm seeing for the most relevant questions here. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your time here. I know Kevin's going to give you a quick recap of some upcoming events, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Kevin, if you want to kind of take us home here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeremiah, and a big thank you to everyone for giving us an hour from your busy Tuesday. Tevora is hosting additional InfoSec webinars in a dedicated series over the entire year of 2020. So 2 weeks from today, Christina Whiting, Tevora's Principal to Privacy, Risk, and Cybersecurity Compliance, she's going to be speaking to the creation of the right privacy framework. So just take a moment, read over this slide. It kind of details and spells out the additional Tevora webinars that are in queue. And as an InfoSec management consultancy to virtually every service in the space, we're pretty prepared and equipped to assist any way that we can. Our teams are going to individually be reaching out to the attendees on this webinar over the coming days just to make sure that everyone got what they were looking for. When we do, please don't hesitate to ask anything of us, be it additional registrations to the webinars that you're referencing. And past that, everyone enjoy the rest of your day and have a great week. Thanks for tuning in.
Great day, everyone. Thank you very much for your time and have a good Tuesday. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.